Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Here I am in Limerick, Ireland. So behind me you can see King John's castle. So built in the 1180s, because it's 1171, his father King Henry II of England came to Ireland, and he intervened because his liege man, Strongbow, had declared himself King of Leinster. Now Ireland is now 4 provinces. It was 5 at one time. Meath was a province, or perhaps you could say a kingdom. There was a High King of Ireland, Rory O'Connor, who's part of an intra-Irish dispute about, oh my goodness, Derva Giller running off with O'Rourke, the Prince of Breffni. I shan't recount the whole tale here. But anyway, so Strongbow, who was the Earl of Pembroke and Wales, Pembroke being a Principality of Wales, but Henry II of England saying to this guy, well, you're under me in the feudal system, I can't have you going and carving out your own kingdom in Leinster, you have to submit to me, which he did. But also the Gaelic chieftains were mostly Gaels in Ireland in those days, an Irish-speaking people, us too, and there was a large Danish community, particularly around Dublin. Brian Boru, the King of Munster and High King of Ireland, he defeated the Danes at 1014, the Battle of Clontarf, just north of Dublin, being actually slain in the effort. But things had gone a bit wrong for us. Ooh. So, travellers, you see, how about that? Ireland's a third world country, as they said in the commitment in 1991. It worked as a joke in 91. It wouldn't work even as a joke now. Anyway, what was the next thing? Anyway, Prince John was Henry II's 4th son. He had terrible falling out with the oldest two, and it wasn't strictly primogeniture in England in those days. So when Henry II returned to England, he'd been recognised as Lord of Ireland by our episcopate and by our secular leaders. Prince John, as he then was, built this castle here in Limerick, and this bridge astride the river Shannon came much later, Thomond Bridge, because in the province of Munster, the northern section of Munster is known as Thomond, and then there's Desmond, which is the southern bit, and then there was another bit, I can't remember what it was, because we had a high king, we had kings, and we had some petty kings. Is king even an accurate translation? It's debatable. Our element of the feudal system. So from this angle you get some idea of the scale of it. And there'd been a settlement in Limerick for nigh on 2,000 years. A bit further up you'll see St Mary's Cathedral. You can probably see the main tower of it there. Yeah, you can. That nearer square tower. And the Vikings were here. They held the Viking Parliament there. The O'Briens were the local worthies, dominated the area well into the 19th century. Later had the title the Earl of Inchquin. Now loads of people have the surname O'Brien, as in suggested actually descended from Brian, grandson of, as opposed to Mac, which is son of. But so you can't all have it, and you know it's like that chessboard paradigm. You put 1 grain of rice on the first square, and 2 on the second, and 3 and 4 on the third, and so forth. They keep doubling them, increases exponentially. There's so many O'Briens, they can't all be king of Thomond, or they can't all be Lord of Inchquin, but they're the head of the family. Now sometimes lots of English and Welsh immigrants came, Anglo-Norman, Cambro-Norman. They were intermarried with the Normans in the 12th century and onwards, and so some of them, they adopted our culture. They became Gaelicised, spoke our language, intermarried, which was absorbed, and others didn't. But there was this large English-speaking community in the Pale. The Pale is Eastern Ireland, which was directly under control of the Lord of Ireland, as in the island was also King of England. But other people were absorbed into mainstream Irish society, such that the Statutes of Kilkenny were passed in 1366, Kilkenny being a considerable city in Eastern Ireland, but it's inland. Saying this was no longer allowed. There was the Englishry, which was sort of the eastern quarter of the country, where the English immigrants dominated, and that English community remained distinct and separate for centuries. Obviously some of them were absorbed into us and they're no longer regarded as English. But our Irish language was not to be spoken in the Englishry, and our sports like hurling and so forth were not to be played. We weren't to practice tanistry, as in fostering others' children. But anyway, it was a dead letter more or less from the get-go. I'm not sure that actually ever formally repealed, but that was the statute of Kilkenny. There was a remonstrance of the Irish princes where our native chieftains complained to the Pope saying this is terrible. One other thing we often don't like to face up to is Catholicism came here because of the English. Like St. Patrick obviously came over from France. He was from the west coast of Great Britain originally, been kidnapped, been a slave here, taken by 9 of the 9 hostages, having to work as a shepherd, finally escaping to France, worked his passage by calming maddened curs, and eventually became a bishop in France, came back here to spread the light of the gospel to us, the benighted heathen. But there was this medieval fallacy saying he was sent by the Pope, and that wasn't the case at the time. And anyway, if you go back to the 5th century AD, yes, there was the Bishop of Rome, but he was on a par with a few other metropolitans, as in of Constantinople, of Antioch, Athens, and I can't remember the 4th one. So it was only 1054 when the church split into East and West that certainly in Western Europe he was saying as being supreme. There was no difference between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church until 1054. But it was made up to emphasize, Catholicism, we must look to Rome. Now, but for that, we I suppose wouldn't have been Catholic, because that's the thing is, the Pope, Adrian IV, he gave permission to Henry II to come over here. There was this tradition that the Pope had a say over islands, Sicily and indeed England, although England's only half of an island. And he said, yes, you can go and do it. This papal bull, Laudabilita, it begins praiseworthily, because papal bulls, these announcements from the Pope, they take their title from the first few words. It's not bull as in bulletin, it's bulla, lead in Latin, it's sealed in lead, saying that Henry II must come over to do this because we weren't paying Peter's pence, we had the wrong date of Easter, we allowed clerical marriage, our monks even had the wrong tonsure, so we had to conform to the European norm, harmonisation. So Brussels, eat your heart out, is all the kind of thing we're in favour of now. Oh, incidentally, we'll have a good look at these flags as we're going. Munster flags, we're the province of Munster, the southernmost province, and really our flag is the 3 gold crowns on a midnight blue background, and then they're doing this sort of red field around it, which isn't traditional, but I think it's the Rugger version of it. So that is the mighty Shannon's flood, flowing out into the Atlantic, the longest river in Ireland, the widest river in Ireland. As you go down towards the sea, it's 7 miles wide. That's the estuary, but then that's obviously a lot of seawater flowing in when you go further that away. And here it is, you can see the hills behind from the hinterland. So it's got a huge, catchment area? No, basin, watershed, where it drains into the Shannon, and quite a few tributaries, the Meg, the Abbey River, I can't even remember the others. So that's King John's Castle. We're getting a bit nearer. You see the round towers, because Richard the Lionheart, who's John's elder brother, he, from his campaigning in Normandy, he realised that the corners are the best place to start smashing down, so don't have any corners. Have these rounded walls like that. Now it's by a river, partly to control river traffic when there's a bridge eventually, to control the bridge, and it was centuries before the bridge was built. Trade is coming here, and the river, you can get fresh water, you can obviously dump your sewage out there, and you can catch fish, because remember, the Pope said we mustn't eat meat on a Friday, but even apart from that, you want comestibles. Your provisions might be running low during the siege. There are a number of sieges of the city, and indeed of the castle. 1642, during the English Civil War, might more accurately be called the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. And then when Oliver Cromwell came to Ireland in 1649, just after he executed our king, Charles I. But I'm not sure if he came to Limerick, but his son, Henry Cromwell, was here. Indeed, he was made Lord Deputy of Ireland, because when our head of state was in England most of the time, he would appoint an understudy to be Lord Deputy here in Ireland, although the title changed a bit from time to time. Like there'd been the Duke of Ireland appointed under Richard II. It was his paramour, Piers Gaveston. And eventually, from the 18th century, the Governor-General, but the Governor-General could also be called the Lord Lieutenant or Viceroy. All these titles are acceptable, but there's the Viceregal Lodge, the residence in Dublin. That's Arasan Uachtaráin, as in Hall of the Chief, the President's official residence these days. So a bit of a closer look at King John's Castle, where the Irish tricolour flutters proudly now. And it was used as a British Army barracks in the 19th century. Obviously 1922, that spring, the British Army left most of Southern Ireland, retained bases on Bear Island, on Spike Island in Cork Harbour, and indeed Lough Swilly. in County Donegal. The Royal Navy retained those installations, and the Treaty of December the 6th, 1921 stipulated that in times of armed conflict or indeed strained relations, London had the right to take over more bases, naval and army bases, and indeed aerodromes, air power being important by the 1920s. So it's been rebuilt and extended and renovated quite a bit. By the mid-1930s, there was public housing in the courtyard there, because we were so short of public housing. It was a time of severe hardship after the First World War, the slump of the 1920s, and of course the IRA had been blowing up bridges and burning down buildings and killing people from 1916 up to about 1923. So we're just knocked back a decade or two economically. Mass emigration, the Great Depression of the 1930s. You may have seen Angela's Ashes. That bloke, Frank McCourt, is from this city and indeed wrote his memoir growing up in straitened circumstances in the 1930s when they hadn't two pennies to rub together. So anyway, it's got a fabulous visitor centre there. It's very interactive, audio visuals, it's highly informative. It's not a huge castle, King John's Castle, not that very tall. You can see the battlements above, don't have crenellations, you can see the arrow slits, so they can see out the wider inside, as in they can point themselves this way or that way. They've got a sort of wider field of vision than you do, but quite difficult to successfully aim if you're shooting in. And these spiral staircases with, so he's got his right hand to fight you as he's retreating upwards, but you have to use your left hand to fight. Well, unless you happen to be left-handed, that's going to be a problem. Oh look, there's the Masonic Hall, yes, of these free and operative Freemasons. I shan't tell you the whole of the Freemasons. This is the North Munster headquarters of the Freemasons. So anyway, that's it. That's most of King John's Castle. Not all of it is original. Obviously, they've rebuilt a bit of it in glass. And that's one of the most enthralling sites to pay a visit to if you come here to Limerick. So we're on King's Island. A bit of Limerick is an island. You may not realise that, because it's got the Shannon on one side, the Abbey River on another. So that's probably about all I have to say about King John's Castle. It's been open to the public for decades, so highly recommended. It's fabulous if you go in. And then there's this fascinating old church here, which formerly belonged to the Church of Ireland, because that was obviously the established church from the 1530s and time of the Reformation, right up until 1870, when the Irish Disestablishment Act took effect. And why they're flying the red flag, but this one was deconsecrated in 1968 because there were so few Anglicans to worship there. The Church of Ireland just couldn't afford to maintain all these ones. And in the early 19th century, everybody had to pay a tithe to the Church of Ireland, paying this tax even if you were not the communicant thereof. Of course, the majority of us were Catholics, so the Church of Ireland had tons of money, and there were loads of sinecures, and there was also pluralism, one clergyman having more than one parish and collecting a salary for all of them, but then paying some junior clergyman to do the actual work in the less salubrious parish. And it was ridiculous. There were sometimes parishes with not a single Anglican in it, but it still had a full-time Anglican clergyman. It was the only job to have. I was reading about Jonathan Swift, one of our most renowned Irish writers, and he had a fine house, high social status, generous remuneration, and almost no work. It was the only job to have. No wonder he managed to produce so many marvellous literary gems. Okay, so that is the edge of this bit of Limerick, and you can see some housing estates beyond this ruin there, not quite sure what that is. And just getting on to ordinary housing. And I mean, in my ignorance, I assumed that Limerick stopped at the Shannon. It doesn't. It goes a bit north of the Shannon, the city. Beyond that is County Clare. Look at that huge mural there on the gable end. It's a famous, particularly Irish art form, but you see it in the wee north, particularly murals relating to the famine. Oh, this thing here behind me, Limerick Civil Trust. This was the Bishop's Palace. But this abode is not that opulent, as in for the Church of Ireland Bishop of St Mary's Cathedral, which you can't see, which is down there. I showed you the spire of it some time ago. But they moved out of here in the mid-19th century, and they erected a new palace near the centre of town, near Bishop's Quay, but the palace doesn't stand there actually, where the site of it is now a Garda station. Now, if you're not Irish, you won't know this. The Guards, that means the police here, Garda Síochána, as in Guardians of the Peace, or civic guards, as in they're not military, because until 1921 had the Royal Irish Constabulary, and they were like gendarmerie, and they could carry rifles and so on, and their role was sometimes counterinsurgent, not just ordinary policing. So you have a disarmed police force. The Guards, so there are some firearms units for situations where that's required, but as standard they don't carry any weapons. But anyway, this has been turned into a civic trust building. It was one point in the early 20th century is used as housing. It was split up into several flats, but it's been renovated and it's open to the public now. Not this time as the shades of night are drawing on. You can see the light is growing crepuscular. So it's perhaps time when I signed off now. So please make sure you follow me on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, and your most liberal donations are greatly appreciated. If you dip your hand into your pocket, dig deep, give till it hurts. I do. And donate to me on Patreon or PayPal. And PayPal, it's georgecallahan79@gmail.com. What else? Choose online lessons with me in history, in politics, in religious studies, in French, in law, geography, things of that nature. Get me to edit documents for you, essays, theses, dissertations, redactions, and so forth. And I do interview practice. I help you with elocution and whatnot. English is a foreign language. I've got numerous qualifications, including from the most estimable seat of learning, which is Limerick University, an MA in linguistics. And pick me as your tour guide in London. All right, I'm going to sign off now. Toodaloo.